Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this important virtual event focusing on the energy transition for urban climate neutrality and how cities can participate and accelerate this process. I'm Susanne Petersen. I'm the director of the UNEP DTU Partnership, a science-based advisory services group engaged in implementing UN Environment's climate and energy strategy. My center has also recently curated, edited, and launched the emissions gap report on behalf of UNEP. And at the time of writing, the emissions gap report showed that the new national climate pledges combined with other mitigation measures unfortunately looks to put the world on track for a global temperature rise by 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. So climate action is needed in order to achieve the targets, and cities is certainly one of the places where things are important, as cities account for about 75% of global energy primary use and are responsible for 70% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, making them key actors in both national and global efforts to transition to a net zero future. So cities are on the front lines of global climate change, and sustainable energy transitions are required for the long-term carbon neutrality. Tonight, we will look at some of the specific challenges facing cities in the energy transition, as well as discuss the solutions required to decarbonize the urban environment and the building sector. I would hereby like to welcome our panelists and of course the audience online that are connected to participating in this event. For the panelists, I would like to introduce them, and we will have a panel discussion with a Q&A section at the end if time allows. The panelists are all from Germany and represent a municipal authority, a private sector company, a government think tank. They will share their opinions and thoughts on the challenges and potential technical solutions for decarbonization of the energy sector, also share their actions and best practices to enable the energy transition and their ambitions for climate neutrality. And for the audience, I encourage you to write your possible questions and comments in the chat box, the Slido, and we will try to address them if possible. Let me start by introducing the whole panel. First, we have Mr. Andreas Kuhlmann, the CEO of the German Energy Agency, DENA. Welcome, Andreas.
Hello, thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Then we have Mr. Carsten Boschers, the Vice President of the Energy Network Strategy in the utility company E.ON. Welcome, Carsten.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thank you.
And finally, we have Mr. Kai Lipsius, the Climate Commissioner of the German city Essen and also head of Essen Green Capital Agency. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. Hi.
Thank you. Let's start with some questions. If I can address you first, Andreas from DENA. Last month, DENA published the final report for the pilot study called Perspectives on Achieving Climate Neutrality by 2045. So I would like to hear, what are your key findings regarding the potential of hydrogen in the energy transition process for the national level, in this case, Germany? There you go.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. Well, yes, it was actually a very huge study we just published. And we work together with about more than 70 companies, with people from civil society, with politicians, with scientists, economists. So we really try to find a way to really find a solution to be climate neutral in 2045. And the good news is we found one. The bad news is it's quite a lot of work to do. So we defined 84 tasks, and every single task is possible, but orchestrating all 84 tasks at the same time, which is necessary, it's quite a challenge. And well, since you asked me about the role of hydrogen, yes, there is quite a big role of hydrogen in our study. But before I talk about hydrogen, let me tell you, I think it's very important to understand that for the moment, we first have to put all the power we have, or at the moment, in using direct electricity from renewables. Increase the amount of renewables and work in all these electric solutions, because hydrogen solutions will come and we will need them, but they are not yet here. So we should not wait until they're ready. We have to move on. We have to use heat pumps, EVs, and all these things, and doing integrated energy transition from an electric perspective. But at the same time, we have to really invest in infrastructure, technologies, scaling a world market of hydrogen, and what we call it power fuels, derivatives of hydrogen for feedstocks and so on. And what we see is we need it actually in all sectors. And I know we always talk about well, we have to use it in hard to abate sectors. But from a German perspective, the building sector also is very hard to abate. I mean, we have all these building stocks, and they are so different, different characters. You have different infrastructures in cities. So maybe that's one thing to talk about. Every city is different, and hydrogen will be very important. And maybe this last sentence, 5 years ago, hardly anyone was talking about hydrogen. But now we see hydrogen roadmaps all over the world. And I think that's really a development. And I really wish that people in Glasgow see this as also as an opportunity for new things coming up, helping us to reach the climate targets.
Thank you, Andreas. Very interesting. If we take the building sector that you mentioned is really difficult, well, you called it hard to abate. It's certainly very large, but it does need to decarbonize significantly if Germany is to reach its target of reducing CO2 emissions by 44% in 2030. And E.ON is, of course, working with various solutions in the building sector. So, Carsten, I wonder, how do you see your role, or what can be done to decarbonize the building sector?
Yeah, Susanne, that's indeed, and Andreas, I'm subscribing to everything you said. The building sector is probably the most difficult one, I would say. If you assume, I'm typically, when I'm explaining how difficult it is, I'm taking this like a square chocolate bars. I don't know if you know them. And if you break it down, it's 4 columns, basically. One is electricity, one is traffic or is transportation, one is the building sector, and the last one is industry. So it's about 1/4 when you looking at 2040, 2050, so into the future. And today we have, from the electricity part, we have 50% of that. So the first 2 bytes, basically. And the rest is fossil. Pretty much in the building sector today is fossil. So that's a huge task. And you mentioned 44%. That's basically the number we are seeing when we are looking at from today to 2030, what we need to reduce in order to meet the 2030 targets. 44%, just to compare that, is about as much as we approved since 1990. So 1990, just to flip back in history, was the year when Germany was reunited, and when we had a lot of old buildings. We had a big investment at that time, so we had a lot of tailwind, basically. So it was quite easy to improve 42%. And now we are looking at 44% between now, which is close to 2022 actually, if we are honest. So 8 years to come. And that is showing how difficult it is. And the sector is in particular difficult because we are looking at asset lifetimes, not like cars where you're looking at 13 to 18 years or so. We're looking at gas boilers that are used for 15, 18 years or so. The buildings are 50 to 100 years life cycle. So it's really, really difficult. It's not just a tanker, it's turning a continent if you want to stay in that picture. And that makes it in particular difficult. And Andreas highlighted the DINA report, and that report kind of sketches out how that can be done, how that sector can be turned. But for us, it's really interesting, or it's of vital interest as an infrastructure operator. We have predominantly electricity grids. That's a significant share. That's about 80% of what we're doing. And then we have a few gas grids, but we also have district heating, which plays a major role. But for us, it's really, since the lifespan of these investments, of grid investments, is also 40 years commercially, 60 years technically. We need to know today what we need to have in 5 years and 10 years. And then on top of that, we also see challenges like e-mobility in urban areas, which is actually energy consumption-wise a significant part of what we'll see in future. We'll see more digital infrastructure in cities as well, which consumes massive amounts of electricity. And that all needs to be taken into account. And our pledge is basically, and we'll probably come to that later on as well, and we elaborate that with Kai together, is that you really need to look into the details. It's every street is different, every building is actually different, and then you need to find a way, and that's what we are actually excited about in this digital world. You can actually really be precise and understand opportunities locally with waste heat, for example, from the local supermarket or from other waste heat emitting sources, even wastewater. But that needs to be very granular. So we need to be really, really, really detailed, and we need to act now and do the obvious stuff in that ecosystem as well, which is efficiency and heat pumps and so on. But we'll come to that later. So we build a digital twin, and I'll tell a bit more about that later on. So my take is we need to really start and look into the details of how we can do the transition.
Well, thank you, Carsten. It's very interesting. You mentioned that the digital infrastructure also requires a lot of energy, let's say. So not everything is reductions, but there's also an increase in certain things. But before I move on to Kai, I was thinking neither Andreas nor Carsten, you haven't really mentioned energy efficiency as one of the tools that could certainly also be used in the building sector. So
I need to add here, because energy efficiency in the building sector is like the core task of my agency. So we are working on this since more than 20 years, and well, yes, indeed. Energy efficiency is super important in the building sector, but then again, it's super complicated. We have a deeper restoration rate of about 1%, and we know that we need it by 2%, but that is like instead of 400,000 homes every year, 800,000 homes every year. So you need people working on this, you need time, you need materials. So this is quite a challenge, and we have to be aware that reaching the climate targets is not just by talking about them and then saying it's easy, we have the solutions. It's real work on the ground, and I think that is what we have to be aware of. It's manageable, but we have to make concrete plans here. Here I agree with what Carsten said.
And I would like to add to that. I think there are two components that we frequently don't mention when we're talking about hydrogen, for example. Efficiency is one that is a no regret move in very many areas. The other one is, even for hydrogen, we need to build renewables. So building more renewables, wind and solar, is of vital interest. We have a tendency to overlook that and jump to the more posh topics, but this is always kind of step zero.
Very good. If we look at the city level, Kai, as the climate commissioner of Essen, what are the specific targets that you've set yourself for climate neutrality, and where do you see the main challenges?
First of all, I think it's very important that we are also defining a carbon budget on a city level. So it's not only about a year when we want to reach climate neutrality, but we have rather calculated how much CO2 emissions should be still emitted over the whole period of time until climate neutrality. And if we then put some linear trends just in this very ambitious budgets, then we have to reach climate neutrality somewhere between 2030 and 2040. Whereas obviously, it's also a question about the speed and how quickly we can actually realize the quick wins and the mitigation in the first years, because otherwise then we don't actually are on the linear trend, and then obviously we would even have to be more quick with our carbon neutrality. And the big challenges, I think they have already been mentioned. It's obviously in the building sector, and I totally agree that we are obviously always in an efficiency first thinking. But as Carsten also said, first of all, it's about then really the whole total decarbonization. So there's always a second, not only efficiency first, and this is not a chronological question anymore. So it's both all of it at the same time, more or less. So we obviously will fail if we don't also manage to raise the renovation rates, and obviously Essen is no different. So also we're more or less in the German average of the 1% renovation rate. And then obviously for cities, the potential for build-up of renewables is somewhat limited. So it's ever more important than to be energy efficient in the building sector. And then obviously in cities, another very big source of carbon is mobility. And obviously here again, it's more or less the same thinking, that it's obvious that we have to think also about EVs, etc. But first of all, it's a question of modal shift. It's more or less the same. First of all, we need to organize a modal shift towards environmental modes of transport, cycling, walking, and public transport. And there we obviously are rather strong on implementing pull measures in the sense of improving the conditions for example, cycling. But a very big challenge also on a societal level, on a political level, is to actually be strong enough then also to implement some push measures in order to actually, at least measures such as rededicating lanes in order to get more space for cycling, and thus actually making it more uncomfortable to use cars. So mobility and building sectors definitely, I think that the biggest challenges in the sense of carbon emissions. And we all also have still not solved the simple puzzles, for example, of how to raise the efficiency level. And at the same time, we really need to think it through, and also have plans on how to actually decarbonize also the heating sources that we will definitely need. So it's not that we have only zero energy buildings in the future.
Thanks, Kai. If you allow me to stay at the city level for a minute, certainly the building sector is, I presume, one of the areas where city authorities actually have some power. I mean, you're issuing building permits, you're, planning potentially new neighborhoods. You could also set targets for low carbon buildings. maybe you are also, let's say, in charge or own a lot of public buildings in your city that you could also take charge of renovating or whatever. So isn't there something that you as a city authority can do yourself?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the areas where we do have direct influence. But first of all, obviously, we always, at least for Germany, it's true that the cities are built. So it's more about the building stock than about new buildings, which obviously doesn't free us from the responsibility to really be ambitious in the sense of new buildings and also asking them to be then carbon neutral, etc. But it's definitely mostly about the building stock. And there you also mentioned obviously two very big blocks. It's the buildings of the municipality itself and also of our social housing company, which has the biggest part of, so it's the biggest single owner of buildings in Essen. And I think they actually are quite good in solving the challenge on how to get to a carbon neutral building stock also in time, which is true for a couple of other big professional housing companies. But in the end, the housing sector is obviously in the end dominated by all those small owners, and they are really challenged how to deal with their renovation and the transformation of their buildings, because it's obviously they don't have the potential to make very professional plans, and also, as Carsten said, to really think economically in 20 years times and calculate it and organize it. And so we see that as a city, this is an area where we have to take action as well. But in the end, this is obviously an area we only have indirect measures, but we really need to enable all the many different landowners that they are really investing in their building stocks and decarbonizing it. But it's obviously an area where we have a lot of focus and a lot of activities. And in the end, especially if you then consider, Carsten said, it's every building has to be considered individually, and in the end we have so many different types of ownerships and motivation sets of those owners. So we also have to take this into consideration. So it's also a social dimension to it.
And behavioral aspect. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Andreas, you of course have responsibilities to prepare the energy transition at the national level, but I wonder from your position, what do you see as the role of the cities in the energy transition? And also, what could, in your view, be the role of hydrogen in a climate neutral city?
Mm-hmm. That's one of my favorite questions. I could talk about hours about the role of cities, because it's so exciting. On one hand, I mean, we know that all the people are coming together in cities more and more. So we use lots of energy in the cities, lots of carbon dioxide. And then on the other hand, we know that all cities are so different. I mean, Berlin, I'm living in Berlin. We have about 4 million people, and it's the city with the most inhabitants in the European Union at the moment. This is funny because if you look at Asia, 4 million is nothing in a city, for example. And then look at all the cities which will still be built in future. There are more, 2 billion people coming, and so they all need to live somewhere. With what kind of materials are we going to build these cities? So that's so many interesting questions. But let me melt it down to Germany, because that's what you were asking me again. Here it's really depending on what kind of infrastructure do I have in the city. Do I have huge district heating system? That would be great, because then I can extend it. It's very efficient. You have high-tech solutions in order to decarbonize that one. And then you have areas where you can really speed up with heating pumps and everything. So where you really can increase the number of heating pumps in buildings, depends on the kind of building you have here and there and the technology of heating pumps, but they are improving. But then you also have areas where we have like huge amounts of people having gas heating systems. Now the question is, what do we do with those gas heating systems? Is there another solution? And here we see, and I think, well, I mean, Carsten knows it maybe even better than me, but here we see that using the infrastructure we do have in the ground for gas distribution and grids can be an option to use hydrogen, to use, of course, biogas, for instance. So, I mean, are there options to make quick progress instead of going into every little house and, you know, changing something to another thing? And here we see huge potentials. I mean, hydrogen, green hydrogen will be cheap in about 10 years from now. I'm very certain about this. The only question is how will we integrate it in the distribution grids? And here we need to have a closer look in special areas, in special cities. How is it really working? What kind of gas pipelines we still need? Which one we have to get rid of? And these are very complicated questions, but we see that there is quite some potential. And if that potential can be taken, then we will be much faster on the way to reach our climate targets. And that is probably not only certain for Germany, but for all areas where you have gas infrastructure in the ground.
Thank you. And you did, of course, bring up also the interesting point that there are many cities that are yet to be built. In fact, one New York is being built every single month in the developing world. And in China alone, one New York is built there every single month. Yeah. So at least out of Europe, where I agree, the building stock is you know, most of it is already built, but, you know, there's a big world out there also, and there, hopefully, the buildings will be very more efficient and so forth. But Carsten, if we go to back to the topic of green hydrogen, this requires twice as much electricity to be produced compared to directly using electricity. So do you think it's smart to use it at all?
That's a very good question. I'd like to connect it to what Andreas said earlier, but let me just start with, if we are just looking at the heating sector, we know that a heat pump, for example, can turn 1 kilowatt of electricity in 2, 3, 4 kilowatts of thermal energy. So it is really efficient since it uses environmental energy that is, or heat that is out there. So that is a really smart technology. And I'm actually, I initially did a diploma in computer science, and there you like to look at kind of infinity. If you play this game until infinity, we are typically looking at 2030 or 2045 or 2050. And then we are discussing how much gas will be left and which kind of gas will be left and so on. If you have in mind that electricity and heat pump in a well-insulated building is always superior, then you will have some convergence towards electricity over time. That is kind of, but the question is, how much of an exemption do we have, because we have other circumstances that make us deviate from this pure and simple optimization problem. That can be specific buildings, for example. It can be buildings that are difficult to equip with heat pumps that are very old, for example, and that we want to keep in that shape because we like them. It's not a majority, but it's a smaller share. Then another aspect is if we are looking at the city as such, as the ecosystem. When I started in the electricity space, somebody, and being a computer scientist in that space, you get excited about that because electricity is something really special, something you get shiny eyes because it's the only product on this globe that is consumed the moment you produce it. So an incredibly complex product, actually. And people working with grid stability and so on can get even more shiny eyes. But that in contra, or if you turn it upside down, also comes with a challenge. If the sun is not shining, if the wind is not blowing, we need to store energy, and we need to be also independent from the actual moment we are producing it. So a system, if you look at seasonal storage and if you look at transport, that is much easier if you use molecules, is very oftentimes better balanced with two different aspects. And then we get into really interesting situation, because Andreas said hydrogen will be cheaper. I think hydrogen will always be, due to the efficiency losses, even so you can produce it in really nice places and maybe transport it here with long pipelines, but it'll be more costly than electricity. Today, when you're looking at your bathroom, you are heating it typically with your heating from typically gas-based, because that's cheaper, and only in exceptions you're using electricity for doing that. That'll flip around, and then we'll have hydrogen, which will be 20% of our energy system complementary. But I think what is really essential, or what is really interesting, is if we have both available, and if we have, that's something you also learn in computer science, something that sees an exponential decline, like the hydrogen price, because both electrolyzers see a learning curve and renewables, and we witnessed that in the past, see a learning curve. We typically underestimate the power of exponential decline. If you think about storage and just recall what storage size physically was, floppy disks in the past, it's micro today. And so if that happens, then we'll have two possible energy vectors available. And that'll be an interesting situation then, especially combined with user behavior that is not always following total cost of ownership considerations. We see in Essen, in the modeling we did, that especially in the southern part, in the more wealthy part, we see the highest share of oil heating systems. Because people don't like the hassle of changing a system in operation. So, and that'll make the situation even more complex. So we'll see a mixed picture out of different reasons. Even so, hydrogen will be more expensive.
Well, you bring up, you know, the unpredictability of the human mind that cannot be put into a computer model and projected and so forth. But very good. Obviously, there's a lot of very, you know, strong and complex projections and analysis that needs to be made, no matter what solution you make.
Let me may I add to that one thought here, because you know, it's not only about reaching climate neutrality somewhere, but it's about reaching it quick as possible. And if we want to reach our targets as quick as possible, then we have to use some bigger solutions. And the idea of having huge amounts of hydrogen in a global market where we can transport it from here to there is one option of having a huge solution which helps us gaining time. I mean, it's a bet on the development Carsten described, but you know, it's up to us to say we take this bet, or there are some out there who say, oh no, well, I don't know, I don't want it, it's better just focus on the other technologies. And I can only say, okay, but if you want to do that, you take the risk of not reaching the targets fast enough. And that's what we're talking about. And that's what we have to consider.
So you call it a hedging strategy.
And I would like to add to what Andreas said, and especially taking the minus 44% in 8 years, which is less than 100 months starting from now, to reach that goal, we need to actually pull every lever we have. We need to use whatever we have in terms of decarbonization. And in many cases, that means looking at some kind of bridge technologies, unfortunately. We just need to build the bridges in a way that they lead us into the future, because we can't afford not meeting the targets, I think.
Well, I have an interesting question, which is probably not so much a bridge technology. There's someone asking, you know, that in Germany, the net is very overloaded in many areas, like in the Netherlands. So what will Ian and Dana and so forth do about it? I don't know if you wish to answer that or not.
Happy to give it a try, and Andreas has probably an opinion on that as well. But what we are doing is, we are doing a lot of investments into the grid. It is one of the leading American investment banks called it a capex super cycle. And the good thing is that we see incredibly a shift towards investing in green opportunities, and that being kind of paying off. Sometimes, however, we are, and that'll hit all of us, we are limited by availability of underground engineering, for example. I mean, it's in theory, it's easy to build, but you need to have the capacity. We are in a couple of Western countries, we are completely maxed out when it comes to building infrastructure. And Tenet sees that as well, I know. And so it is something, it is a huge effort to build, but we need to do that actually. And it needs to be complemented where possible with hydrogen, for example, in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and in Schleswig-Holstein. So around the coast, we are seeing that hydrogen projects are emerging, which can be a good complement.
Okay. If I turn again to the city level, if we look at, the role of hydrogen in a climate neutral city, how high can you see cities support this, and also the emergence of a hydrogen ecosystem, and what stakeholders do you need to engage in if you were to really use hydrogen in a city? Kai?
Yeah. So I think, obviously, there are a couple of aspects to this question. First of all, we need to start again. So it's kind of the main message. There's no time to really create the master plan and actually, first of all, think about possible final grids in the sense of and hydrogen grid, etc. But we already see hydrogen applications emerging. So our public transport company, for example, already made the decision that they're going to run the buses on hydrogen. And obviously, it's going to also, again, as a matter of capacity, take a while, but until 2030, we expect that we have a zero emission bus fleet. And then we are at the same time having taking the role of a little bit of a moderation of all the different private companies who have stakes in hydrogen. And in Essen, we are very lucky in the sense that we also have big players in the energy sector, like E.ON, for example, where we are able to really represent the whole ecosystem in the sense of production, transportation, and also then obviously using the hydrogen. And in the end, it will be shown with what kind of usages will also come along the road. So we have obviously some industry, glass producing industry, an aluminium smelter, and eventually they all gonna also decide on one of the decarbonization options they have, and it is not yet decided whether it will be hydrogen. Because in the end, it's mainly for the glass industry that they need heat, and they produce it with gas at the moment. So there are other options. Whereas, for example, obviously in steel industry, it's also has some more structural components on the chemical side of the production as well. But so what we feel is that we really need to bring together those stakeholders and create opportunities. And we are talking about, for example, creating a H2 island, let's say. And obviously we see that in a couple of years' time, it's quite possible that this hydrogen island, which is maybe having the hydrogen from a electrolysis in one of the in our trade fair center, that it's going to then switch to a bigger backbone hydrogen transportation with import from green hydrogen on the ports in the Netherlands or something like this. But yeah, it's really about creating opportunities, starting and gaining experiences. And obviously, one of the big questions still is what we have been discussing before. Is there also a role of hydrogen in our mass distribution grid? And again, it's also, in my opinion, very important that we are also, try to elaborate on this by also trying and finding early movers who use hydrogen also for replacing, for using it to heat their homes. But in the end, obviously, it will be really not that we can need to orchestrate it from the beginning and have the final picture already written down, but that we need to create a learning curve in the cities as well. And I think there are some opportunities, and you need to really involve the stakeholders. And then in our case, we've found very many different stakeholders who are now practically preparing and planning in order to have also hydrogen as part of their energy supply.
Thank you. I was thinking, Andreas, maybe a question is why it's so important to set up, how the green hydrogen strategy and network can be built up and coordinated, but also linking to Glasgow, we have also a question that is quite interesting. You said also earlier that in the Paris Agreement, hydrogen was not really an issue, and why has it progressed so fast, and what are the safety risks? And someone is giving a reference to Hindenburg back in 1937, whether this has put people off from hydrogen for a long time, and now it's quite of a sudden taking off. Would you have any comments to that, please?
Yeah, well, that's long ago, and of course things have developed, and so technologies advance and so on, and there are of course many other bad things happening with other technologies we nowadays use like without thinking about it. So that's I would call it progress, no? But I mean, I was not complaining that nobody's mentioning hydrogen in the Paris Treaty or something like this, of course. But what I would wish that along the IPCC scenarios, the hydrogen option should be considered more. I think there's a blind spot when it comes to chemicals, feedstocks, and stuff like that. So maybe that's coming. But what I really find special and encouraging about this hydrogen hype, let's call it hype for a moment. I mean, if you look back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, yeah, we always saw something new coming in our race to zero. No, it really is. And I mean, 10 years ago, if somebody would have said temperature rise will be with what nations promise be along 2.7%, that would have been a huge progress. We started between 5 and 6 or whatever. Now we are at 2.7 because we have more technologies coming up, and maybe hydrogen helps us in the next coming years to get it down to 2.2. And then in the next innovation, we get probably down to 1.9 and so on. You know, what I mean is we have to be open for new options, helping us in this climate race. And that's why I think innovation, scaling up innovation in generally is so important. And here I see really something getting started, and now we have to do the real job. So that means for Germany, we have to invest in infrastructure, because nobody would do a project somewhere in the world if we can't promise them that we do have the infrastructure. And we have to make regulation, of course. So like standards for hydrogen. We don't want gray hydrogen. We want to have climate neutral hydrogen. So then we need to create this market. And if you look at it now, it looks messy because there's so much going on. And if things are looking messy in the way they look messy now, I would say, this is exactly what we need at the beginning. There's so many initiatives, projects, and they will come together. I think this market will be very visible in about 3 to 5 years, and we will see all these projects coming, and we see funny, interesting solutions. One thing which is very much underestimated, for example, is decentralized use of hydrogen. We're creating a platform here at the German Energy Agency where we bring people together and where they describe how they use hydrogen in decentralized projects, like in districts, when they use it with overcapacity of solar, for example, and using the waste heat from electrolyzers and so on. So we have so many technologies we can bring together, and hydrogen technology is just one part of it. So for smart solutions, it can be very helpful, also from creating it from other technologies. So we have to be open for these things, watch them, and rather be open-minded than to keep it away from us.
Well, we actually have, quite a number of participants from all over the world, and also from Latin America and so forth. And one of the questions from presumably someone from Latin America is whether all these very interesting energy transition projects and ideas that you brought to the table, whether they could support other regions, for example, through the Euro Clima program for Latin America.
Let me, if I may, 2 thoughts on this. First of all, there is a great project in Chile at the moment with Siemens Energy, Porsche, the car manufacturer Porsche, and who else? I forgot. And they are creating like e-fuels, sustainable aviation fuels and stuff like that. So that's just a try, because renewable energy is very cheap in Chile, and they make an example over there, and they want to transport it to Germany, create some kind of a new market. And that, of course, should also be then a technology which might be used in Latin America as well. There's one thing, one danger. Yeah? I mean, if we create a new market for hydrogen, we really have to be careful that we don't make the same mistakes we did when we created this fossil market. Because, I mean, look what we did with these countries, and look what happened in countries of the global south with fossil fuels. I mean, this cannot be the kind of relation we need in future. So if we create a new market for a new good which helps us fighting climate change, we have to have fair partnership conditions. So not only running into Africa, taking the solar and running out, there needs to be more responsibility, and this needs to be on the agenda. And I hope all the NGOs will help us in creating that fair market in the future.
Yeah, no, I think we'll probably veer off the subject, but you're right. Just transition is very important, and certainly in Africa, the solar let's say, revolution has very much been powered by international companies exporting their wares and technologies without creating local production, local capacity, local ownership, and so forth. But,
Susanne, if I may add to that, I think there, of course, is the risk. I'm with Andreas, but I see also this can be something much bigger. When we are looking at steel, for example, there's a company newly founded, H2 Green Steel. they are producing steel not where steel has traditionally been produced, which is in the Rust Belt in the US, in the Ruhr area, which is the German Rust Belt, if you want to, where you have that competence and the facilities. No, it's in northern Norway, Sweden. Why is it there? Because energy is cheap there. So the change of the energy system will also change the world and provide opportunities to places that haven't had these opportunities before. So I think it is something that will have a significant impact in the future. So I think, yes, it's right. We don't need to redo, or we must not redo the mistakes of the past. But I think it's also, and that is something Kai and we see in the Ruhr area, we need to get our act together to make sure that we have a future for the industry here.
No, absolutely. But on the other hand, does the energy transition mean, Carsten, that many people will be paying more for their energy supply in the future?
Yes.
So
that is a especially interesting question in this time when gas prices are peaking, and we haven't just the announcement in the market cause already politicians to act. We haven't seen the actual price increase happening. So, and I was living in quite a few places and traveling a lot before Corona, and I think we have. It's also essential, and we know that after Corona even more, that we must not leave anybody behind in the society, because if we arrange the energy transition in a very unbalanced way, it'll get difficult. And that's why we we were just curious, and when we did this, we took a data set of every household in Essen. You can, in the city of Essen, you can buy that in the market. It's kind of from many people volunteer to give their data in return for some free services like bonus points and so on. And if you take this data, you can simulate actually every household and aggregate that up. So you have a couple of parameters: what kind of heating system do they have, how many square meters, and it's not accurate in a sense that it's the actual data, but it is kind of comparable to actual data. And then you can look at what in energy transition for a city like Essen does. And then we found out that we'll have a social imbalance in the city. We'll have a couple of areas where you have predominantly bigger houses and more modern houses and higher incomes. In these places, you can easily do, for example, an electrification plain way, because you insulate more, you have an expensive heating system, and it's not increasing what you are paying each month for warm living. If you are looking to less wealthy areas, you typically find lower housing standards and a lower income. And these places need to be renovated as well, which is a huge peak then. And you can translate that to rural areas as well, actually. And so we found that a straightforward standardized approach, a cookie cutter approach for every region the same way doesn't work. That was for Essen. We then simulated that in some areas, some form of gas helps. And we used synthetic methane as a reference. And that helped because in those areas where you have tiny apartments or smaller buildings, old buildings, that would see high renovation costs, you see that the OPEX, the operation expenses, are lower because the buildings are smaller. And therefore, even if the gas is the kind of more expensive approach, because as we said, hydrogen will be even more, will continue to be more expensive, and SNG as something that is a follow-on product as well, that seems to be the socially more acceptable approach. However, we looked at other cities then as well. We looked at Leipzig, for example, where we have a well-advanced heating grid. And in Leipzig, you can, with a mixture of heating grid and electrification, you can do the trick. No gas needed, for example. And then you have other places. So you need to very well balance what the actually best approach is. Can be local systems on the rural side with biomethane, for example. It can be, but we need to get away from the one-fits-all approach, because then you are really making people poor. And then, but what we need to do is we need to adjust and find the best way. And then with regard to hydrogen, we shouldn't be too anxious on the price levels going forward as well, because what we're seeing is as well that if you are comparing our purchase power today due to productivity increases we saw over time to, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, then you see that the purchase power goes up. So I think the energy transition also in general, since it's spreading over time, will have an aspect of that. So we'll be due to productivity increases and higher incomes, we'll be able to accept higher prices in future without actually relatively paying higher prices at that point in time. So again, we need to really be detailed. It's not a one-fits-all approach.
And then that's obviously very, very interesting, the sense of how to orchestrate and how to organize then the decision making. And then because obviously with this digital twins, we can quite particularly show what kind of measures should even be taken on a building level, to say, like, we can calculate the plan for the building, what kind of heating system should it have, is it actually economically sensible to insulate everything, etc. But obviously it's then a very interesting if how then to actually make it happen, especially obviously if which is obviously quite a specific situation, maybe grid operators for gas and district heating are even in competition, etc. And also they are not actually being the ones who are having the decision-making power about, Carsten explained it, how many oil heating there's still in the south of Essen. That's also a very, very important question, obviously, and very, so there's a strong case for having a much stronger approach of energy planning in cities and heating planning. And on the other side, we also again have a legislative challenge, how then to actually advocate the kind of best solutions. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Maybe Andreas, for a short intervention at the end here. How important do you feel that it is to set up linkages between local, regional, national, international levels, and how would you establish international supply chains, for instance? A short answer, please. I know it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, we in our country, we have to make sure what kind of infrastructure we will have. Yeah, we have to make open to the world. This is our plan for the infrastructure. Then the European Union and other regions should sit together and talk about standards. So what kind of hydrogen do we want? How do we measure? Where does it come from? What are the rules and stuff like that? And then we have to, well, best would be to have higher carbon prices. That would help, honestly. And then, just let the companies go. And they know how to make this business. But well, infrastructure, standards, and regulation is very important. We in Germany, we try to talk about this with all the partner countries a lot, and but there are more projects than talks we have on the table, I would say.
Very good. I think that will probably be the last intervention. So I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their thoughts and practices and knowledge about the roles of cities, but also the roles of course, other stakeholders like the company side and the national level. After all, it will never be too late to take climate action to fill the emissions gap and try to control the global temperature. And obviously joint efforts from all parties, both at the city level, private sector, and the national and think tank level can help in that process. And I'm also very happy to have such an international audience online, and I really thank you for being together with us even this late on a Friday evening. So hopefully it's been interesting and worth your while. So I thank everyone and wish you a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a quick bye-bye to all of you.